What comes to mind when you think of witches? Powerful, beautiful women like the seductress Circe who transformed men into pigs? Or perhaps old women with pointy hats huddling around a cauldron and cackling? The witch has a long and very complicated history spanning the entire globe. And for a time, the Western world was absolutely obsessed with witches, particularly hunting them down and making them pay dearly, often with their lives, for the terrible crimes that they had supposedly committed. People lived in such fear of witches, for a witch could be anyone, a passing traveller, your next door neighbour, or perhaps even your own mother. Now, of course, everybody's heard of the Salem witch trials, but today we're going to cover the infamous case of the Islandmagee witches. It's a bizarre and chilling case that has it all. Not one, but two mysterious deaths, a haunting, demonic possession, spectral attacks, and wait for it, even a cursed apron.
A cursed apron, eh? Well, I'm sold.
Our story takes us to Islandmagee, a peninsula on the east coast of County Antrim, Northern Ireland. It's beautiful, with rolling fields, spectacular limestone cliffs, and a lovely sandy beach. Despite its beauty though, it was a place that sailors believed was bewitched. You see, compasses mysteriously stopped working here. It was home to a small community of around 300 very religious Presbyterians that were of Scottish descent. They lived a typical rural lifestyle, with many being farmers or fishmongers or fishermen. Now, the first character I need to introduce you to is Anne Haltridge. She was a deeply pious woman, a model matriarch that was very well respected in the community. Her late husband John had been none other than the Presbyterian minister of Islandmagee, and this was an exceedingly important position, cementing the family's very high social status. She lived in a 2-storey thatched house, no head house, with her son James, his wife, and their 2 children. And of course, no household would be complete without a couple of servants. It was a September evening in 1710, and Anne had settled down by the kitchen fire to relax a bit after a long day. Suddenly, something small and hard struck her on the back. Startled, she looked around, but she couldn't see anything. Then she was struck again. This time it was more forceful and even slightly painful. She turned around to face the open window behind her and saw a stone come hurtling through, just narrowly missing her. Somebody was throwing stones at her. She marched over to that window to give the culprit a piece of her mind. But when she peered outside, no one was there. This was very strange and a bit frightening. She reassured herself though that it was probably just children playing a prank or a game and nothing to worry about. Anne decided to head upstairs and into the safety of her bedroom. It was a warm evening, so she left the window in here open to let in a nice and gentle breeze. She climbed into her bed, but just as her head hit the pillow, the stone throwing resumed. Stones were now hurled at her through the bedroom window with such force that the curtains began to move. Anne lay in the bed confused and scared, watching the window and the growing collection of stones on her bedroom floor. After a while, the curtains suddenly flew open, and Anne felt a strange, heavy and dark presence slowly creep over her entire body. All the windows in the room began to creak open, and then they slammed shut. Creak and bang again and again they went as the shutters violently rattled. Anne was getting increasingly frightened, but there had to be a rational explanation for this. She mustered all of her courage and jumped out of bed. She fumbled around in the dark room looking for someone or something that could be causing it, but there was nothing. The strange occurrences would continue. The next night, as Anne was sleeping, the pillow was forcefully pulled from under her head, and then the blankets were torn off her and flung onto the bedroom floor. A terrified Anne leapt out of bed and went to fetch her granddaughter. The two returned, armed with a candle, to search the room. It was as if the light from the candle lifted whatever presence was in there, but as soon as that candle went out, the presence returned, along with the darkness. This confirmed it for them. They were dealing with something supernatural. Thankfully, things seemed to calm down after this, and 2 months went by without a single unusual occurrence. But this peace, it wouldn't last. Once again, Anne was sitting by the kitchen fire, and the sky had just begun to darken. A little boy around 10 or 12 years old made his way into the kitchen and sat down beside her. He had short black hair and was covered in dirt. He was wearing torn black clothing and was wrapped in a tattered blanket that he used to keep his face covered. The blanket trailed along on the floor behind him. Anne thought that maybe he was a poor beggar boy hoping to get some food. She asked where the boy had come from, but he didn't respond. She asked him if he was cold or hungry, but he still didn't respond. She then asked him his name and if he would please show her his face, but this made the boy angry. He leapt up and began a frightening and menacing dance around the kitchen, nimbly twirling and leaping, all the while still staring at Anne, but making sure that the rest of his face was still covered. He then jumped out of the kitchen window and ran to the bottom of the garden and into the cowshed. The servants, of course, ran after him, but the boy had vanished. They gave up the search and returned to the house, only to find that somehow the boy was there, waiting for them. The same chase would happen again and again, about a dozen times, until one of the servants threatened that the master of the house would be returning soon and would certainly catch him. The boy then disappeared, seemingly for good. A pattern began to emerge. 2 months would go by without even so much as a peep of the supernatural. And then the boy returned again. Anne, being the deeply religious woman that she was, sat down reading Dr. Weddersburn's sermons on the Covenant, a huge tome of a book. Once she'd finished, she sat the book down on the table and went about her day. She came back to get the book, but it had mysteriously vanished into thin air. It was so strange because no one else had been in that room except her. Anne turned the house upside down looking for it, but it was nowhere to be found. The next day, the shatter of glass could be heard as the boy in black thrust his hand through a window holding the missing book. The boy would then speak for the first time. He told one of the servants, Margaret, that he had seen the book lying on the table next to the Bible and some glasses, and he had taken it whilst everyone else was down in the kitchen. He made it clear that he would not be giving it back. Margaret asked the boy why he didn't take the Bible too, and the boy responded that the Bible was just too heavy for him. Margaret asked the boy if he could read the book, and the boy replied that yes, of course he could, for he had been taught to read by the devil himself. This revelation shocked Margaret, and she began to bless herself. The boy laughed and told her that she could bless herself as much as she liked, but it wouldn't save her. The boy then pulled out a sword and threatened to kill everyone in the house. A terrified Margaret quickly bolted the door and took the Haltridge children with her into the parlour. The boy started laughing again. "Oh, you think you are safe, do you? But I will get in yet," he said. "How?" Margaret asked. "The door is locked." The boy replied that he could come into the house through the smallest hole, like a cat or a mouse, because the devil could make him anything he pleased. The boy then picked up a large stone and hurled it through the parlour window before disappearing. A little while later, the boy was seen once again, this time trying to catch one of the family's turkey cocks. He succeeded and threw it over his shoulder. The bird put up a really good fight though, causing the stolen book to fall to the ground. Margaret would seize this opportunity. She quickly rushed outside and picked up the book. The boy then laid the bird on its back. He raised his sword to try and kill it. The turkey struggled and managed to wrangle itself free though, thankfully making a great escape through the garden hedge. The boy's diabolical assault on the Haltridges would continue. He smashed another window and then removed all the intact panes of glass from the parlour. This still wasn't enough for the boy though. Oh no. He walked down to the end of the garden and began digging a hole with his sword. Margaret watched him for a little while, and then mustered the courage to ask the boy what he was doing. The boy paused his digging for a moment, and then he responded, "Making a grave for a corpse that will come out of this house very soon." The boy then jumped over the garden wall with such ease that it was like he had been a bird flying.
Demon! He was definitely a demon. They're always causing so much trouble, you know?
Anyway, even though the boy was now gone, bizarre events still continued to happen in the house. Stones and turf were hurled at the windows and the walls, making such an unholy and terrifying racket. This attack went on incessantly for a whole 8 hours, while the Haltridges huddled together terrified in one room. Strange noises were heard throughout the entire house, scratching, laughing, knocks on wood, and the strangest of all, ducks quacking. Anne's bedclothes were mysteriously taken off her bed and piled in a heap on the floor. The servants remade the bed, only for the bedclothes to be removed once more. This time they were found very neatly folded and placed under a table in the room. Again, the servants remade the bed, and again the bedclothes were taken off and finally arranged in the shape of a corpse lying in its burial shroud. This was an omen of what was to come. Rumours of the haunting at No Head House started to spread like wildfire. Concerned neighbours visited the house to see if they could find a rational cause for the strange events. They searched the house high and low, but could find nothing. They concluded that something supernatural was indeed going on, and so they sought the sage advice of the local minister, Reverend Robert Sinclair. Reverend Sinclair decided that he and a few others would spend the night at No Head House. They would fast and they would pray throughout the night to try and drive out that evil entity. They prayed and they prayed and they prayed, but to no avail. As soon as darkness descended on the house, Anne's bedclothes were once again rearranged into the shape of a corpse. Anne was a strong-willed woman though, and she did not let this deter her. She thought that it wasn't good to give place to the devil, so she boldly went upstairs to her haunted room to sleep. At midnight, a loud cry could be heard coming from Anne's room. Reverend Sinclair rushed up the stairs to see what had happened. He found Anne writhing in unbearable pain. She said it was as if someone had driven a knife into her back. The presence had won. Anne was now far too frightened to stay in that room any longer, and who could blame her? Poor Anne never did recover. She remained racked with pain in her lower back. She spent the next 7 days confined to a spare room in the house, unable to leave the bed. She would sometimes sit up and gaze into the distance as if she'd seen someone or something. Sadly, Anne would lose her fight against the entity. She died on the 22nd of February, 1711. Anne's son, James, would be away in Dublin for a while, so his sister and their cousin, Mary Dunbar, came to No Head House to keep his wife and their children company. They certainly needed it after the tragic loss. Mary had never been to Islandmagee before, so it was very exciting. She was 18 years old and came from a gentry family, so she was quite high up on the social ladder. She was described as being educated, intelligent, and very articulate. That night, when Mary and James's sister were getting ready for bed, they noticed that some of their clothes had been scattered throughout the house. As Mary went to gather up the clothes, she found an apron lying on the parlour floor. It was rolled up tightly and held together by a string, tied with 5 strange knots. This was very odd, as the doors and the windows of the parlour had been locked for a few days. How had the apron gotten in there? Rumours were swirling that Anne had been bewitched to death, and this terrified the household. Nobody wanted to touch that apron. They feared that those knots meant something sinister, that there was a charm in them that would harm someone in the family.
Oh, you're having me on. They were really scared of some knots on an apron. Now I could really give them something to be scared about. Quack! 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 Quack!
Well, that was certainly something. But you know, in their defence, after everything that had happened, I'd probably be scared of some knots too. Mary wasn't though. She had the same thought as you. It was just an apron, for goodness sake. So she carefully untied the knots, and inside was Anne's bonnet, and this had been missing for over a week before her death. The rest of the family looked on in horror, for they knew that this was image magic. This was usually carried out with a waxen image of the victim, but knotted strips of material called poppets could also be used. Actions performed on the image would transfer to the victim through a process of sympathetic magic. To them, this was proof that someone had indeed bewitched Anne. Now, if only they'd left that apron alone. Opening it caused the entity in No Head House to stir once more. Once again, the bedclothes were ripped from Anne's bed and thrown onto the floor. Mary went upstairs to investigate Anne's room, but as she climbed the stairs, she was seized with a great pain in her thigh. The pain was so intense that she fell down and cried out. James's sister and Margaret heard Mary cry. They rushed upstairs and carried her off to bed. The pain eased for a little while, but it would return even worse than before, and this time all over her body. She began to convulse and seize violently for at least 8 hours. She then started to shout loudly before calming and softly repeating to herself, "So and so, so and so." As morning arrived, Mary finally recovered. The Haltridge woman asked who Mary had been talking to. They were confused because there was no one else in the room but them. Mary told them that several women, witches, had appeared at her bedside. They attacked her in spectral form and they had threatened to kill her. She'd never seen any of them before. I mean, she wasn't from Islandmagee, remember? But She had managed to catch the names of two of them, Janet Main and Janet Carson. She gave very detailed descriptions of these two women, and it matched their appearances to a T. Word of Mary's claims reached Janet Carson's daughter, who was of course very concerned. Her mother certainly was not a witch, and she had absolutely no reason to try and harm Mary. These were grave accusations that needed to be put to bed, and quickly. So she consulted Reverend Sinclair, who she hoped would straighten things out. Unfortunately, her faith in Reverend Sinclair was misplaced. He arranged for Janet Carson to be brought to Knowhead House for a test of her innocence. As Janet was approaching the house, Mary was overcome with a great terror, and her body became very hot to the touch. She started to stare and look around her as if there was something or someone there in the room that the others couldn't see. Then, to top it all off, just as Janet was outside Mary's door, unannounced I might add, Mary exclaimed, There's Janet Carson!" As soon as Janet entered the room, Mary was struck with the most intense pain, and 3 strong men were unable to hold her in the bed. Janet was removed from the room and asked to pray for Mary's health. Mary's fits would continue, and she was visited again by the witches in spectral form. There were now 8 of these women. The next 2 that she would name were Janet Liston and her daughter, Elizabeth Seller. Once again, she gave perfect descriptions of these women. They were brought to Knowhead House by Reverend Sinclair to see how Mary would react to them. He had a battery of clearly very foolproof tests that he would perform on these women. First, he organised an identity parade to make sure that Mary wasn't just accusing innocent people of witchcraft. He gathered a whole 30 women to see if she could correctly identify her attackers, and Mary succeeded at this test. She was not in the least bit moved by the other women. But as soon as those accused women entered her room, she would cry out that it was them and convulse with intense pain. He then made Mary face away from the door and had 3 men lined up at the bottom of the bed so that Mary couldn't see who was entering the room. The women were then brought in very quietly and in secret. As soon as they were in Mary's presence, she convulsed and was overcome with an intense pain. Then there was the touching test. The accused were made to touch Mary, and I'm sure you can guess Mary's reaction. Yep, she convulsed and was overcome with an intense pain. The final test in the Reverend's repertoire was to examine the accused women on the articles of the Christian religion, such as making them recite the Lord's Prayer and also the Apostles' Creed. Sadly, the women would fail this last test. Reverend Sinclair brought his findings to the magistrate, Mayor Clements, and he would now take over the investigation. This was definitely not good news for the accused women, because Clements had them arrested and then locked up. It was widely believed that once a witch was in jail, they weren't able to attack their victim so fiercely, if at all. And Mary's condition did ease for a while, but then it would gradually worsen. She would begin to show all the classic signs of demonic possession. The witches had summoned demons to possess her body. They frequently took her power of speech, and this would only return to her when she read passages from the Bible as guided by the hand of God. Her jaws were tightly clenched together, meaning that she couldn't eat or drink. It was as if she was being strangled. She grabbed at her throat and violently kicked her legs. Any prayer that was said by the Reverend would anger the entity that possessed her, causing her fits and convulsions to worsen. The witches, they threatened her terribly, telling her that they would put pins, hair and feathers down her throat, and that they would destroy her. They were certainly true to their word. That same night she vomited 5 large pins with wool, feathers and horsehair. Strange animals were seen scurrying across Mary's bed and then flying out of the window, perhaps the witches' familiars. It then all reached a truly terrifying crescendo. One night, after suffering from a particularly terrible attack of fits and convulsions, her back arched and her body contorted into the most inhuman positions. Then Mary began to levitate above the bed. The men keeping watch over her fought with all their might to keep her down, but they couldn't. She floated up all the way until she touched the canopy of the 4-poster bed. The house was then filled with a heavy sulphurous smell. It was the smell of hell, the smell of damnation. As the days passed, Mary would name more and more and more spectral attackers, giving very detailed descriptions of them. The women she described were poor, they drank alcohol, were unkempt, outspoken and rowdy, had arthritis, were pockmarked, were blind in one eye. With that behaviour and those appearances, of course these women were witches. How could they not be? Each of these women was subjected to the same battery of tests, which sadly they would all fail. Her accusations resulted in the arrest of 8 women. The trial of these women would begin at 6 in the morning on the 31st of March 1711. Now, usually it would be the victim that led the prosecution case, but the day before, the witches had robbed Mary of her power of speech, telling her that she would not be able to give evidence against them in court.
Wow, what a great way to get out of speaking in court. I'll have to remember that one for my next court appearance.
No, Gargi, you just have to stop getting into trouble, okay?
Bit late for that. Next one is on Thursday.
The trial was a bit of a shambles because there was no lawyer to manage it. The evidence was produced in a very, very haphazard way, so the events were confusing and really difficult to follow. The trial would last until 2 in the afternoon, and this was a particularly long trial for the time. Both sides gave their evidence and their testimony, and after quite a bit of deliberation, the jury brought in their verdict. The verdict was that the defendants were guilty of exercising witchcraft on the body of Mary Dunbar. They were sentenced to a year's imprisonment and to stand in the pillory 4 times. Now, if you thought that the trial would be the end of all of this, well, you'd be very wrong. Mary was attacked again in spectral form, this time by a man, William Seller. And if the last name sounds familiar, that's because his wife and daughter were among the convicted witches, Janet Liston and Elizabeth Seller. He too was put on trial and was found guilty of bewitching Mary Dunbar. Now, 3 weeks after the first trial, Mary would sadly die of unknown causes, and this made William Seller's crimes a capital offence. He was found guilty of murdering Mary Dunbar, and it's thought that he was tragically executed. Although none of the convicted women were put to death, the outcome was still terribly tragic. Their lives would have been completely ruined. There would have been pariahs, and the stigma would have lasted for generations to come. The conditions in that jail would have been appalling, and the pillory was a very awful, painful and humiliating experience. They would have been bent over and pelted with rotten fruit, vegetables and rotten eggs for hours and hours on end. Apparently, the mob of people was so frenzied that they threw vegetables at one of the women until her eye had been beaten out. So, what really happened here? Okay, so obviously these women were not witches. They were women who were easy targets. They didn't fit into society's ideal of what a woman should be. They should be demure, beautiful and nurturing, not outspoken drinkers that were rowdy. They stood absolutely no chance against the accusations of Mary, who did fit the ideal and was much higher up on the social hierarchy. It was believed that witches were agents of Satan, and women, of course, had such weak minds that they were very easily corrupted. Now, Reverend Sinclair kind of made things a little bit worse. You see, in the Presbyterian community, it was the church that would usually investigate and deal with witchcraft accusations. Any punishments were usually very minor. There was no litigation, and an agreement would be made between the two parties. However, instead of turning the case over to the church authorities, the Reverend brought it to the civil magistrates, and this made it a legal matter. These poor women were punished for crimes that they clearly didn't commit, and much, much more harshly than if the usual procedure had been followed. So, what about Mary's possession? Well, there's so many theories, I don't even know where to start. It's possible that a medical condition was causing her symptoms, such as epilepsy for the seizures and pica for the vomiting of pins and hair, etc. Pica is where people compulsively swallow all manner of things that certainly shouldn't be swallowed. Or maybe she was suffering from a conversion disorder where stress and anxiety are converted into physical symptoms. A much more sinister theory is that maybe she was faking it. You see, possession cases were very well documented, so she would have a clear script to follow, and she could play on the community's superstitions. But how would she have known the names of the women and such detailed descriptions of their appearances? Well, maybe Margaret was her secret weapon and they worked together. Now, Margaret would have known these women and what they looked like. They chose women with very, very distinctive features so they could be easily picked out of a lineup. Margaret could have also alerted Mary when the women were approaching or in the room, so that Mary could react appropriately. This raises another question though. Why would she fake it? Well, some have likened possession to a play. It's a very theatrical display. It would allow Mary to be the centre of attention and act in ways that a gentlewoman of her kind usually couldn't. In such religious and conservative society, she may have felt oppressed, and this was a way to break free. But we also can't rule out the possibility that Mary really did believe that she was possessed, and this precipitated her physical symptoms. Now, what about all of the other strange occurrences in the house? Well, perhaps Margaret had a part to play here too. She was the common factor in this all. She was always present when the supernatural events occurred, and sometimes she was the only witness. For instance, James and his wife were not there when the boy in black smashed the window and tried to kill the turkey. But why would she do this? Why would she make this up? Well, a similar reason to Mary. It would have afforded her a great deal of attention that she wouldn't have usually gotten as a servant. Or maybe there really was a presence in the house. We'll never know. Whatever the case, the sad reality is that 9 innocent people had their lives completely ruined based on the testimony of a single teenage girl. Thankfully, this would be the end of the dark witch hunting chapter in Ireland. It was the last known witch trial there, so we can be hopeful that no one else had to share in their tragic fate. If you got something from this video, Gargi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe, make sure to stay away from aprons with strange knots, and I hope you have a magnificent day.